Hi, my name is Suzanne Sellers. Today is Friday, April 19th, 2019, a day that is celebrated in the Christian faith as Good Friday. It is a Good Friday indeed for me as well. Today is video number 13 in the series that I am creating titled Why the Federal Law named the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997 Needs to be Repealed. Today's video will be Suzanne's story and how ASFA applies to it. Some of you all may know, I have a past history of suffering with substance use disorder. When I was a child, I had I would call a tumultuous childhood. There are things happening in my childhood that were not favorable to me, that were traumatic to me, and that I wish I didn't have to endure. I was a smart child. It was discovered very early in my life that I had an exceptional intelligence level for other children my age. I was double promoted in elementary school from kindergarten to second grade. I skipped first grade, which means all throughout elementary school and high school, I was younger than the other students in my class. I'll get back to that. I'll share a little bit later about why that is significant in my life. I graduated from elementary school as valedictorian of my class. I graduated from elementary school actually on my 13th birthday in 1981. And I went to high school, but high school proved to be difficult for me because not academically, but because the untreated trauma from my childhood and other environmental factors, people who I was around, people around at school, some people in my family, they exposed me to different things that took my mind off school. And I began smoking weed and drinking in high school regularly. Hanging out with the wrong crowds, doing the wrong things. I started skipping school and just hanging out all day, drinking and smoking weed. And then in my senior year of high school, who does this? I withdrew from high school completely. I went up to the high school and told them that I didn't want to be in school anymore, and I pulled out of school. I continued to smoke weed and drink for a while. When I was 16 years old, I need to mention that when I was 16 years old, I first tried cocaine for the first time with somebody who lived in the neighborhood of this high school I went to. I didn't really like it. That time I was wondering what everybody got out of it. I didn't feel anything. It didn't affect me any kind of way, and I didn't really understand it. So I walked away from it, and I didn't think about it anymore until 2 years later, when I was 18 years old, a family member reintroduced me. But before then, I was, I had dropped out of school. I was just smoking weed and drinking all day, hanging out with friends. I finally did re-enroll in high school. I re-enrolled in an alternative high school and graduated from high school about a year later than I should have. After that, I went to a community college and took 1 or 2 classes, and I transferred from there to a adult continuing education program at a local university. But I dropped out of there very soon after I had enrolled because, again, I was smoking weed and drinking and hanging out with friends. When a family member reintroduced me to cocaine at age 18, I was immediately hooked. I knew immediately at that reintroduction that I was hooked. I felt differently that time than I did the first time I had tried a couple of years prior. I continued to live my life, doing drugs cocaine on the weekends and, socially until the addiction spiraled. and I began to use more often, like every day. I got pregnant with and gave birth to my first child, a beautiful baby girl in my mid 20s. And she was the most beautiful creation I had ever seen. I remember having such big dreams for us and how we would live our life together as a family. But those dreams were shattered not too long after her birth. While she was yet a toddler, a call was made to the DCFS hotline alleging that I was not taking adequate care of my daughter because I would take her to the homes of family members and friends when I used to want to go out on drug binges. I thought that was the most loving and caring thing I could do for my child, was to take her to people who would care for her properly, because I knew that I would be out on a drug binge and I would not be able to care for her properly during those 2 to 3 day drug binges. The family member, it's ironic that the family member who called on me is the one who reintroduced me to cocaine at age 18. Custody was granted to a family member, and I was going back and forth, but I was still using drugs. I admitted to the caseworker, I admitted to the judge that I did have a drug problem and I did want treatment for it. I did not want to be on drugs. I wanted help to stop, and I didn't know how to stop, and I didn't know anything about treatment or how to access it. I asked the caseworker to send me the treatment. She sent me to an outpatient program that was completely inadequate for my situation. The program was about a 45-minute where I would go sit in a group for about 45 minutes once or twice a week, and people would be sitting in a circle talking about their drug problems. I stopped going to that program when it became obvious to me that people were still getting high. Who were coming to the group. As a matter of fact, one guy came one day, it was summertime, he had on a t-shirt and there was blood dripping from his arm from an open track mark. It appeared as if he had shot up some drugs right before he came into the room, and that repulsed me, seeing the blood running down his arm. Not that he was on drugs, because I was on drugs too, but because of the blood running down his arm and because of the whole setup. I knew that I wasn't going to get clean there, so I stopped going. And I did what people do when they stop going, is I kept getting high. I did tell my caseworker at the time that treatment was insufficient, and I asked her to send me to another one. That didn't happen until after I gave birth to my son. About 2.5 years later, after my daughter was born, I gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. However, while I was in labor with my son for about 36 hours before giving birth, I was at the hospital in labor, and they wouldn't let me go to the bathroom. I had to use the bathroom while I was in labor, and I asked the nurse to help me to get up out of the bed to go to the bathroom. And she said, "No, we don't want you to hurt yourself. We don't want you to fall. How about you just stay in the bed and use the bedpan?" Which I did. And I thought the nurse was pouring, when she would come to collect the bedpan from me, I thought she was disposing of its contents in the bathroom, but she was pouring the contents of the bedpan, my urine, into urinalysis cups, and they were testing my urine for drugs and alcohol without my knowledge or consent. When it was time for me to give birth, right before they were about to wheel me into the delivery room, the nurse came into my room and said, "We've tested your urine for drugs and it came up positive, and we've already called DCFS, and when you give birth to your son, DCFS will shortly after will come and take your son into custody." And I was devastated, and I had this knowledge going into the delivery room, so it was a difficult delivery. indeed, not only because of the physical part of it, because giving birth is difficult anyhow, but because of the mental and emotional state I was in at the time. And they did just that. That nurse made good on her word, what she had told me. When I gave birth, they cleaned my baby off and handed my baby to me. And I held my baby and looked at him and talked to him for what I estimate to be about 3 minutes. And that nurse took my baby out of my arms on the delivery table, and I have never had custody of my son since. Even while still at the hospital in recovery from the childbirth, I asked to go to the nursery to visit my son. And when I went there, a security guard, armed security guard, stood over me with his hand over his gun for the time that I was sitting in the nursery trying to be a mother and cuddle my son. So I left the hospital without my son, one of the most devastating things that has ever happened to me. And I immediately called the caseworker after I got home and asked her to go to treatment, to send me to another treatment. I didn't get referred to that other treatment center until it was several months after my son was born. He was still a baby. That treatment did turn out to be inadequate. It was a 28-day inpatient treatment center, but it was close to home. I knew some people there. Just a lot of things, a lot of circumstances made that treatment center be inadequate for my needs as well. And also, I had a full-fledged addiction by then, a full-blown addiction, and I think I needed more than 28 days. So I completed the 28-day inpatient treatment, but I relapsed a couple of months after that, after I got out. I asked her for treatment again. I said, this time, can you send me to some place that's longer than 28 days and someplace that's away from my home? Because everybody knows when you're trying to get off drugs, you need to get away from people, places, and things. And people, places, and things was at the treatment center I was at. So I wasn't able to get clean there. So I asked her, will you send me in a long-term treatment facility long way away from my house? She said, no, we're not sending you to anywhere else. We've just given up on you. You're going to be a drug addict for the rest of your life. I was not content with that answer. I knew that I wasn't going to be a drug addict for the rest of my life. I just didn't know how or when I would get off drugs. But I purposed in my heart that I would get off those drugs. So I kept using drugs until one day I was at the crack house and I was getting high with some other people who were at the crack house. It was about 5 or 6 of us sitting around the table, and I just blurted out in the middle of the crack session, I blurted out, has anyone in this room ever been to drug treatment? And if so, where did you go? And one woman said, yes, I've been to drug treatment, and I went to a 90-day program in Illinois, but far away from home. And I said, where was that? And she told me what to do to sign up for a bed for that treatment facility. The very next day, I went and signed up for that bed. And they called me a couple of months later. It was a couple of months before a bed opened up. They called me for the bed, and I went. That was on September 22nd, 1997, the day that I entered the 90-day treatment facility in Illinois, but far away from my home. And I have been sober ever since, over 21 and a half years as of today. Now, after I got sober in the 90-day treatment facility, I left there and went to admit it myself with the help of the people at the treatment facility that I found. I entered a 2-year recovery home program, residential. I went and lived in a recovery home on Chicago's South Side. I was completing programs, parenting programs, spirituality programs, all kind of different programs that they had and groups that they had that I had to attend every day in the recovery home. I was being dropped weekly and randomly while at the recovery home, and I was being tested for drugs and alcohol in those random urinalyses every week. I also was going back and forth to court trying to get custody of my child. This was in late 97 and early 98 when I was in the recovery home. 2 months prior to my entering treatment, I entered treatment in September of 97. A couple of months prior to that, I believe in July, the caseworker had filed to move my case to termination of parental rights. And she told me it was because a new law was being passed named the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997. And because of that law, everybody who's been in the system already will be moved to termination of parental rights. I was devastated when she told me that in July, but it just gave me a further unction, a further desire to want to get clean. And that's that's a big reason why I went to the treatment facility in September of 97 when they called me for the bed. So I'm in the recovery home. It's early 1998, and I'm in the recovery home. I'm making remarkable strides. I'm going above and beyond anything that the caseworker has asked me to do. On my services plan that the DCFS caseworker gave me, I was asked to either work full-time or go to school full-time. I worked and went to school. I was told to either attend self-help groups or go to church. I attended self-help groups and went to church. I was working, going back to college, going to church, going to self-help meetings several times a week, completing satisfactorily all the programs and requirements of the recovery home I was living in. I found an apartment out of the community where I had been living before I went to treatment, and everything was remarkable, a remarkable 180-degree turn in my life. Everything that I had known and I had been doing prior to entering treatment, it was just like night and day. Even the recovery home staff told me that I was one of the best and the most adamant about staying sober persons that had ever entered that treatment facility. I fought with everything I had for 2 years to try to get my children back, but that was to no avail. It took the termination of parental rights proceedings 2 years to go through the system, and then on November 10th, 1999, which is the date of my termination of parental rights trial was to occur, I was coerced into signing over my parental rights to the couple who had been fostering my children. They said they coerced me by saying, my case has been in the system too long. My children are with a married couple. I'm not married. Even though I had 2 years and 2 months sober at the time of the termination, they said they still don't know whether or not I'll ever use crack again. It's, that 2 years wasn't enough. They also said if I didn't sign over my rights, that the judge was going to terminate my rights anyhow, and if the judge terminates my rights, my children will go on a global database, and people from all over the world will be able to see that they were available for adoption, and my children will be adopted overseas, and I'd never see them again. I was told that I would never get a job in life because a involuntary termination of parental rights would mean that I would have a criminal record, and anytime I filled out a job application and they checked my background, that the termination would show up and I would never be able to work again. And given all of those different lies that I was told, I very grudgingly signed over my parental rights. Now, here is where ASFA affected my case, and here's how ASFA applied to my case unfavorably, negatively. Here's how it harmfully captures many people, and it's why ASFA needs to be appealed. First, reasonable efforts. The caseworker did not make reasonable efforts in order to reunite me with my family. Reasonable efforts were not made. The first treatment that she sent me to was an outpatient treatment that was totally unreasonable. It was not reasonable. I needed more treatment than that. I asked for more treatment than that, and I was not provided it. Secondly, then they sent me to, after my son was born, sent me to a 28-day treatment that was not reasonable. It was not reasonable because it was not adequate to meet my needs. I explained to them and told them that my addiction is further along than what a outpatient or even a 28-day treatment is designed to help people overcome. And I need more help than that. But they, I believe, intentionally did not give me more help than that. And in addition, that's the only thing that I was provided, was that inadequate outpatient and the inadequate 28-day. No other services, to my knowledge or recollection, was provided. So reasonable efforts were not made. Retroactive review. That applied to my case. That's a part of ASFA that says that they can look back 18 months after. Once the law is passed, they can look back 18 months and terminate everybody's rights whose case had been in the system, regardless of why it had been in the system that long. My case was in the system long because of the continuances of court dates. I have no responsibility over that. Each court date is 3 to 4 months apart. And then if it continues, if something happened, if the judge gets sick or if anything happens and they continue the date, that just pushes the court date out, the court case out longer. It's not my fault about the court and the administrative rules and the DCFS, how long it takes things to get through the court system. However, they said my case had been in the system a long time through no fault of mine, and they did a retroactive review once ASFA was signed in 1997 and said because it's been in the system, then I qualify for termination of parental rights, and that's not fair, and it's not, it's just not right. Time limits. There's language in ASFA that says that the state can move to termination of parental rights for any case that's been in the system 15 of the most recent 22 months. Again, your case may be in the system for longer than 15 months for no fault of yours. People don't have any control over how long it takes a case to get through the court system, how booked the calendars are, how fast the judges call the cases or anything like that. So it's not our fault. And then, and also, it may take longer than 15 months to rectify whatever situation brought you to the attention of the system. I mentioned that I attended a 90-day residential inpatient treatment followed by a 2-year residential recovery home. 24 months and 9 months equals 33 months. That's well longer than 15 months. Is 33 months a long time? Sure it is. But is it a long time considering that I have been not clean, I hate that word, that I have been sober for 21 and a half years and have every intent to be sober for the rest of my life? That is a small price to pay. 33 months is a small price to pay for lifelong sobriety. And so 15 months is not sufficient. TPR, termination of parental rights. They move to terminate people's parental rights when they shouldn't. In my case, the only allegation against me was inadequate supervision for taking my daughter to the home of family members. Now, they terminate people's rights when for severe abuse, for rape, for murder, and for things like that. I get the same punishment as rapists and murderers and people who starve children get when all I did was take my daughter to the home of family members and friends where she could be safe. That is not fair. That is not just. That is not right. ASFA has language in it for options, that states have the option of not terminating someone's rights if the person is with a relative, if the state has a compelling reason not to terminate the rights, and if the state will admit that it didn't do its job correctly in the case, they can say that they don't want to terminate. Well, they wouldn't put my daughter and my children with the relative that I had selected. I gave them the name of a relative who was willing to take my children, and they didn't give my children to that relative because they didn't like the neighborhood that the relative lived in. They also would never say that they didn't have a compelling reason or that they didn't do their job, because that would be them telling on themselves. And it is not likely that anybody, especially a state agency that's funded with federal and state funds, would say that they're not doing their job. Concurrent planning. All along, while they are supposed to be providing reasonable efforts to help you reunify, they are also planning at the same time to have the child adopted out. Those two goals are schizophrenic. You either going to reunite or adopt. You can't be doing them both, and especially the same caseworker is responsible for doing both of the planning at the same time. So it's likely that one of the goals will get more attention than the other. And in my case, and in the case of thousands of others, it is the adoption goal that gets the most attention. And because of that is another reason how ASFA affected me harmfully, and my children and my family harmfully. Financial incentives. There are a lot of incentives in ASFA for states to be financially compensated for removing children from the home and for adopting them out. And there are no financial incentives in ASFA for them to keep children together. So if they are to keep children with their birth families. So if states are incentivized, if they get money to do the adoption but don't get money to do the reunification, it is likely that they will not do the reunification when they could. And so that affected my case as well. Ease of adoption. There's language in ASFA that makes it easy for states to adopt out, that makes it more palatable, more feasible than reunification. And that is a problem, and that applied to my case as well. And 9, ASFA targets substance users. There is language in ASFA that says that that the law wanted the state agencies and federal agencies that are over child welfare to do a demonstration project to find out how many children are in the system because their parents use drugs. That is not fair, and that is not just for them to only be concerned about substance abuse, because there are many other reasons why children come into the system, and for them to segregate just that population means that we are targeted, and that is unfair, and that is unjust, and in my mind is unconstitutional. I'm not a lawyer, but it is a lot of things in ASFA that are unconstitutional. So these are the ways that ASFA negatively affected my case and my situation, and has negatively affected thousands of other cases since mine. I read on social media this morning an article where a study was done about, and says 1 million children have been adopted since ASFA. And my question is, how many of those 1 million children were properly processed through the system? How many of those families were not given a chance? How many of those families were wrongly had their rights wrongly terminated, have their rights violated? Oh, I didn't mention during my story how my rights were violated when they tested my urine for drugs and alcohol without my knowledge or consent. Numerous rights violations happened to me by DCFS directly during my case. How many of those 1 million children had their families treated properly and with respect with dignity and and lawfully during their child welfare case. That is the question that needs to be asked. So for people to promote that 1 million children have been adopted, I think it is a shame that 1 million children have been adopted and not 1 million children have been reunified with families who can properly and safely take care of them. The child welfare system nationally does not do enough to ensure that, and that is a shame, and that is a problem, and in my mind it is unconstitutional. ASFA needs to be repealed. Will you help me repeal it? I surely hope so. Thank you.